Hello everyone, welcome to Upon Completion. My name is Morganite, and today I'll be taking a look at my experience with playing God of War. All footage shown will be from the first few hours of the game, so no real visual spoilers for anyone who hasn't yet played the game, but I will talk about some plot and mechanics that are spoiler-ish later on. Definitely not the end game, so you have been warned. Now, to be clear, I'm fully in the camp of gamers that grew up with the original trilogy, so I certainly do have some nostalgia goggles on when it comes to older games. I did, however, replay the main trilogy in the 2 months leading up to the new God of War release, so I do also have a fresh look at the series and how it holds up. Hearing that this new God of War was both a reboot and a sequel, I, among many other longtime fans of Kratos and his adventures, was understandably worried. I very much didn't want a game that was an exact copy of the original trilogy. As I've gotten older, I've developed carpal tunnel in my right wrist, and button mashing heavy games like the original trilogy are actually immensely painful to play anymore. Believe me, replaying the original trilogy was excruciating since I was trying to crank through them before the new game launch. So new game mechanics that didn't make me bash the square button with my thumb for the whole game was a big plus for me. I also didn't want a true reboot, as the original games actually hold up quite well aside from some weird clunky control schemes. And the idea of having to start all over with Kratos' story wasn't something I was interested in. We'd played through his revenge story and his death, or supposed death, and I was curious where they could take the story next. I also didn't want them to back down from the gratuitous monster gore of the original games. The QuickTime takedown events were stunning and incredibly satisfying, the original trilogy being some of the few games that actually got QuickTime events right by making consequences if you fail them, namely having to whittle the boss back down so you can try again, which often ended up in your death if you got sloppy. So while I could do with a lack of button prompts getting in the way of cool monster takedown visuals, I really didn't want to lose the feeling of taking down these beasts as messily and as epically as possible. Well, I'm happy to say that the new God of War ended up being everything I'd hoped for and more. As you can see from the video that you've been watching, the graphics are absolutely stunning. I played the game on a regular PlayStation 4 and never had any issues with frame rate drops or stuttering that I could tell. The detail in the visuals is near overwhelming in places. I got lost staring at the wrinkles on Kratos' face and the fur on his armor, not to mention the enemy designs and the overall environment. I was completely blown away by the camera work also. The whole game felt like a film, with the only immersion-breaking moments were when you pulled up the menu or death screens and the occasional portal travel. Other than that, any loading that the game was doing behind the scenes was well and truly hidden. Every time I thought that the scenery couldn't get more interesting, we hit a new area and I was completely blown away again. The different realms are all visually different and are incredibly fun to explore. Well, I did have some issues with 2 of the maps, but I'll get into that later, and it really wasn't because of the visuals. The level up system borrowed from the RPG genre, basing Kratos' stats on his armor choices, skill unlocks, and rune upgrades, which is vastly different from the originals, and for some people unused to the RPG genre may take a while to figure out. But overall, I found it largely satisfying. A big deal breaker for me was going to be the combat. How did the game actually play? As no matter how pretty it looked, if the game didn't feel good to play, I was going to be disappointed. In this case, the combat is incredibly satisfying. At first, I was a little concerned how fighting with the axe would feel, but thanks to the clever controller mapping, I found it intuitive to use. Not only does it feel appropriately heavy, but the impact when you slam your axe into an enemy just felt so good. Your son Atreus, or boy, as he is more often referred to, is luckily not your typical escort mission character. While he's weak early on, he does grow more competent over the course of the adventure, helping you to stun enemies and take them down much more effectively, as well as learning his own sets of rune summons. He will occasionally get knocked out, but he's back on his feet in a few seconds and back into the fray. Think Elizabeth from BioShock Infinite over Ashley from Resident Evil 4. His combat chatter is also remarkably helpful, calling out when enemies are trying to flank you or sneak up on you from behind when you're focused on something else. In effect, it pays off to actually pay attention to Atreus during combat, or at least not tune him out entirely. As a character, Atreus is remarkably likable, barring one sequence later in the game. You see him gain confidence and grow his skill, and his relationship with his father slowly becomes closer over the course of their adventure. The only real wrench in his development is a sadly truncated and failed character art. Without spoiling things too much, Atreus goes a bit overboard after learning his true nature, becomes a hugely unlikable character out of nowhere, and then just as suddenly everything's cool again. I do realize that the developers only had a short amount of time to fit all they wanted into the video game, but this came and went so quickly with so little build-up that when the shift in attitude to a complete jerk happens, which does make some element of sense, but the abrupt change and the sudden reversion back to the Atreus we'd actually come to like and care about, it was unfulfilling and unrealistic. This was really something that should have been drawn out for a longer time in a much more subtle manner in order to generate the reaction from the players that devs were clearly trying to evoke. Instead, I was left more confused, kind of going, wait, what? He's over it already? What? It could have been done better. The rest of the cast in the game is remarkably small, and this was a decision that was actually quite suited to the game itself. The focus on Kratos' relationship with his son and too many other relationships would have been distracting. The characters we did get were perfectly mysterious, annoying, humorous, and were in the game just enough to make an impact but not distract from the main story. Brok and Sindri in particular ended up being my favorite characters in the game and constantly made me chuckle when I was least expecting it. Something I didn't really register until after I'd completed the game was the distinct lack of female characters. The game starts with the Viking funeral of Kratos' wife. The witch, whose real name I won't spoil, was a wonderful mother substitute, and she worked as a foil to Kratos, kind of reflecting how poorly he was handling various aspects in interacting with Atreus and understanding the boy's needs. Her character reveal late game story arc was unexpected and tied in beautifully to the rest of the game. Other than the dead maternal figure and the semi-maternal replacement, the only other female characters that we encountered in the game were the Valkyries, which are boss enemies that are scattered around the world, and were not required to beat in order to complete the game. Now, again, the main focus was on Kratos and Atreus' relationship, so the lack of female characters didn't bother me too much, but it is something that I hope to see addressed in the later games. Then again, I don't want female characters just to check a box. They would need to be relevant to the story, and their inclusion would need to make sense. I just hope that the series doesn't fall into the trap of having all of its female characters be dead or antagonists in the long run. The story is a sweeping epic while still managing to keep its focus on Kratos and his son. It, for the most part, managed to successfully handle character growth and not just with your main two protagonists. I was pleasantly surprised by how much character development was given to side characters like Brok and Sindri. I don't really want to get too deep into the ongoing plot beyond the initial quest of take Mother's Ashes to Mountaintop because as popular as this game is, I really don't want to spoil any of the major reveals because being able to go into the game with no knowledge of them helped my enjoyment of the game be so much more impactful. Every time I thought that there's no way this can get any better, it somehow managed to do so, and I don't want to take that from anyone. So a big part of the enjoyment was also tied to the ability to explore new realms in the game. Alfheim was beautiful and very much not what most people would think of when hearing that it's a realm of the elves. I will, however, say that I was sorely disappointed with Muspelheim and Niflheim. Now this is largely because rather than being plot-oriented realms like Alfheim and Helheim, these were largely thrown in there as bonus areas to test your strength. Muspelheim is a challenge mode requiring you to do things like kill a certain number of enemies in a short time limit, kill them in a certain area, the ever popular survival mode where the goal is to just not die until the time runs out, keeping your son safe, and then not getting hit while killing enemies. This section of the game is kind of an add-on that people find fun for extending the gameplay and is reminiscent of the challenge modes you could play in games from the original trilogy. I had two problems with this particular map. First, you have to beat this area at least once through in order to defeat the Valkyrie that is hidden in the final arena. Second, you can acquire some of the best armor here, but in order to get all the parts, you have to play through it a second time with tougher challenges. As I mentioned earlier, I've developed wrist pain that flares up when I'm forced to button mash in games, and while the main game of God of War didn't cause me any issues, this particular section of the game was excruciatingly painful. I actually had to stagger my visits to this realm and doing no more than 1 or 2 challenges every few IRL days because my wrist hurt so bad. I ended up only doing the challenge once through, determined to beat the Valkyrie, and then took my half-upgraded fire-themed armor and left it at that. Niflheim is potentially even worse, as what many players consider to be the best armor is locked behind farming this area, and still having enough pieces from Muspelheim left over. What makes this area so difficult? Basically, the whole realm is toxic, and Kratos takes steady damage over time. Once his tolerance for the poison drops, his health bar rapidly falls, and if you don't make it to one of the 2 high ground safe areas, he dies, and you lose all of the items that you just harvested. Plus, the area is a randomly generated dungeon with blade-filled hallways, spiked walls, and random batches of enemies, including a Valkyrie that is lurking somewhere within. There is some really great loot hidden in this area, and I did spend some time farming it in order to acquire the armor here, although again, I wasn't able to fully upgrade it because I couldn't bring myself to go back to Muspelheim for the pieces. I also unlocked some of the chests in the central reward chamber. However, I wasn't in the mood to continue grinding to unlock everything, and I'm sad to admit that the Valkyrie in this area remained undefeated in my first playthrough. While these areas aren't my favorite, I can understand their inclusion, although part of me wishes they'd taken the Valkyries out of these areas for people who weren't interested in the grind involved, or people like me who have to ignore physical pain to acquire everything. One of the best parts of the game is how it repeatedly ups the ante. Every time I thought the game couldn't get better than it was, it somehow managed to top itself. The boss fights got more and more interesting. Many of the takedowns were more elaborate and awe-inspiring, except for the trolls. The trolls were always the same. The set designs were also epic, just like the original trilogy. I always thought that the set designs were the biggest star in the game. The world map you can access does keep getting bigger and bigger, and almost to an overwhelming extent, but I was so immersed in the world that I couldn't get enough of it. Plus, about halfway through the plot, you unlock a new weapon, and I cannot even begin to explain how joyful that segment was. All said, you can spend as few or as many hours in the game as you want. While some areas and bosses are gated until you manage to level Kratos up high enough, you can still access the plot of the game without doing everything. Although, with how amazing the game is, it's well worth the time sink to get as much out of it as you can. I really feel that this attention to detail with regards to the characters, the lore, and the world was really what made God of War so successful. Yes, the graphics are stunning, but graphics alone do not make best-selling games that actually resonate with its players. This game blew my expectations out of the water, and for a long-time God of War fan, that's saying something. I can't recommend this game highly enough for original fans and gamers new to Kratos alike. This is a surprisingly heartfelt adventure with great combat, epic takedowns, and a wonderful tease for more to come. I'm sincerely hoping that Santa Monica Studios can pull off the quality of this game once again for future installments. So if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe for more videos like this, and comment below telling me what you thought of God of War and your experience with the game. Either this one or the original trilogy. I'd love to hear. So I'll be back soon with the next installment of Upon Completion.